Hello, welcome to Context. I'm Orkun Amashov here to ask relevant and pertinent questions in pursuit of eliminating answers. Nearly 2 months after Abdullah Öcalan, the jailed founder and leader of the Kurdistan Workers' Party, known as PKK, issued a statement calling on the group to lay down arms and dissolve, the organization in question has now formally declared its disbandment. Designated as a terrorist organization by Türkiye, the United States, United Kingdom and the European Union, the PKK convened its 12th and, as we understand, very last Congress in northern Iraq late last week, where it adopted the decision to self-dissolve. The PKK's legacy is not solely one of a 4-decade insurgency against the Turkish state per se. It's also marked by brutal tactics, the kidnapping of foreign tourists, suicide bombings, attacks on Turkish diplomats, and the violent repression of Kurdish civilians who refused to support the militants. In its announcement, the group declared it had completed its historical mission, adding that the Kurdish question has now reached a stage where it can be resolved through democratic means. Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan hailed the announcement as a historic milestone for regional peace and stability. The reality, of course, remains relatively complex. The issue related to PKK and the surrounding elements extend far beyond Turkey's borders. On the 10th of March, the Syrian Democratic Forces, SDF, dominated by the People's Protection Units, known as YPG, signed an agreement with the central government in Damascus to integrate into the Syrian state. Ankara, along with many other actors, regional and some global as well, regards the YPG and the SDF in its full entirety as a Syrian extension of the PKK. There is indeed much to unpack, and joining me now from Istanbul to help us examine the circumstances surrounding the PKK's dissolution and to examine and assess its implications for the wider region, including the relations between Ankara and the new government in Damascus and to a certain extent with Iraq, is Ambassador Matthew Brycer, former US diplomat, assistant expert in regional affairs. Ambassador, thank you very much for joining us today.
I'm very happy to be with you. This is a super important topic.
Thank you very much indeed. Ambassador, Turkey's conflict with the PKK has never been entirely domestic matter. From the early backing of the Soviet Union to later reports on the involvement of a wide range of actors, including Western and regional actors, the PKK has long benefited from external support and financial support as well as part of it. What has recently, as of early 2025, changed in that international context?
That's a great question. And one reason why, by the way, PKK has been such an internationalized movement is because it claims to represent the plight of the Kurdish people, which is the largest nation on the planet without a state. And so the Kurdish people have many sympathizers in Europe and around the world, but the PKK does not represent all the Kurdish people. The PKK is clearly a terrorist organization. So what has changed is, number one, in Turkey, Türkiye, there was a decision made by the nationalist far-right leader of Turkish politics, Bahçeli. Last October, he made an announcement saying he was calling on the PKK to disarm and suggested that its leader, Abdullah Öcalan, should be released from prison. So that showed a changing political dynamic here in Türkiye. And I think what was motivating that is possibility for constitutional changes or nearer-term elections in which I think Bahçeli thought it would make sense, together with the ruling AKP, to be able to appeal to Turkey's Kurdish voters. And, you know, almost 1/5 of Turkey is Kurdish in terms of ethnicity. But what also changed is Turkey's very effective use of drones and drone strikes against PKK forces in Iraq. We were able to kill over 500 senior operatives. And then finally Syria and the ouster of Bashar al-Assad in December, the very surprising victory of the HTS and al-Shara, who was able to, let's say, persuade the PKK's branch in Syria, the YPG, or the Syrian Democratic Forces, as you said, to integrate into the national military forces of Syria. All of these things were happening at the same time. And with the removal of the YPG as a separatist, let's say, branch of the PKK, so too did vanish the aspirations of the PKK to be able to try to create a separate Kurdish state carved out of the territories of Syria, Iran, Iraq, and Turkey.
Ambassador, you already partially replied to the questions I'm going to ask now, but still I would like to move back into domestic context. But Turkish analysts particularly emphasize the necessity of distinguishing between fighting terrorism and terror organization. And they say that the problem with the whole concept of terrorism embraced by PKK militants, that was the main problem, and that ideally the plan should have been based on the idea of defeating terrorism as a concept. Do you see any merit in this evaluation, this analysis made by some Turkish analysts?
Well, it's really splitting a hair. I mean, if you look at the Turkish government statements, I mean, I've been working on Turkey since 1998. And all throughout, the Turkish government has generally condemned terrorism, and they'll say in recent years, they'll say in Syria, for example, terrorism of the so-called Islamic State or of the YPG PKK. Usually, of course, they mention YPG PKK first, and ISIS or ISIL or Daesh second. But for Turkish foreign policy, there's always been a focus on fighting terrorism and terrorist organizations. I think the distinction that is not appreciated in the United States and in much of Europe is that, again, as I said before, the PKK or the YPG does not represent all Kurds in Turkey or all Kurds in Syria. It is a Marxist-Leninist terror organization that aspires to carve a Marxist-Leninist state using violence, so that's terrorism, out of the territories of Turkey and Syria, Iran, and Iraq. So that's a distinction that needs to be made. In Syria, for example, I think the Kurdish, about somewhere around 20% of the Kurdish population is a supporter of the YPG's political arm, called the PYD. And so, again, the PKK and its affiliates cannot claim to represent the Kurdish people writ large. They can, however, claim to represent a fraction of the Kurdish populations of these countries, but not all of them.
And the fraction is not the preponderant majority, or just a fraction?
No.
Perhaps could be aptly described as a minuscule fraction. PKK's that very statement issued on the 12th of May says that they have completed their historical mission. There is a kind of sense of righteousness there, self-righteousness in that statement that we tried to do the right thing, we achieved something, Kurdish issues now can be sorted out by means of political discussion. So what will happen to the members of PKK who are currently in Turkey? Will they be somehow integrated into Turkish political life? What will happen to them?
Yeah, I don't agree with the PKK's self-characterization either. I mean, the Kurdish issue has been on the agenda for a long time. There didn't need to be a resort to violence as the PKK did and the terrorist attacks you described in the opening. Back in 2007, you'll recall that President Erdogan said, we have a Kurdish problem in Turkey and the solution is democracy. And unfortunately, the violence resumed later in 2015. Your question is the key one, and the answer is I don't know. Nobody knows what's going to happen to the PKK fighters. Some, I fear, will not lay down arms. Some will want to continue fighting. And I think we saw that sort of a difference or a dichotomy within the PKK last October when there was a terrorist attack on a defense company in Ankara. Right at the time that the nationalist leader I mentioned before, Devlet Bahçeli, announced his belief that Öcalan could be let out of prison if the PKK disarmed. I think that attack on the defense industry's factory in Ankara was conducted by members of the PKK that did not want to lay down their arms. So some will want to keep fighting, and they'll probably remain at Kandil Mountain in Iraq, and that problem will need to be taken care of over time, but there'll be a small number. There will be, having worked on the PKK issue earlier in the George W. Bush administration, we were dealing with the same question. And what we came up with and what the Turkish government came up with, which is probably what they'll do now, I would guess, is say that there can be an amnesty for those former PKK operatives who lay down their arms, who promise never to take up arms or terrorism again, promise to integrate into Turkish society, and crucially, did not commit any violent crimes, did not kill anybody, did not commit any terrorist acts. Those who did commit terrorist acts, I would guess, will probably be prosecuted. Whether they're pardoned at some point or what punishment they'll receive, that still needs to be worked out. But in any case, none of these issues have been discussed publicly. And in fact, what the PKK said in its announcement last Friday that it was going to disband itself, it said that Abdullah Öcalan, our leader, when he's let out of prison, which isn't 100% guaranteed, it's expected, but when he's let out of prison, he will decide how to proceed with our disbanding. Well, I think the Turkish government will also have a word about how to deal with the remnants of the PKK.
And let's talk about northeastern Syria, about SDF, Syrian Democratic Forces. They have agreed to integrate into the Syrian state. That deal was agreed back in, I think, on the 10th of March of this year. And what does this signify for Syria? We understand the current government, the interim government based in Damascus, is struggling in terms of uniting the country, but they have achieved something quite considerable, in particular after March. Do you believe that that section of Syria, northeastern part of Syria, will be properly integrated into the central government apparatus? And what is your evaluation of that effort made by government of Ahmad al-Shara to actually usher a new stage in Syrian history?
Well, it's impossible to predict with any accuracy what will happen in northeast Syria and whether those sorts of remnants of the PKK or the YPG who want to fight will continue to do so. And it's also unclear to what extent al-Shara will be able to consolidate his authority across all of Syria. I mean, in Latakia and the Alawite strongholds that were loyal to the Assad family, there were clashes several weeks ago that were quite brutal. There were militias that toppled the Assad, that helped to topple the Assad regime that moved from the south, whereas al-Shara came from the northwest, from Idlib province on the Turkish border. So he's been working since December, he being al-Shara, to consolidate his power. And I think the agreement by the YPG and the Syrian Democratic Forces overall to fold into the Turkish military is the most significant sign so far that al-Shara is consolidating his authority and is then moving toward creating some semblance of stability, but still there's a long way to go before there's a normally functioning political power again in Syria. But fortunately, you know, many of the professionals and the bureaucracy of the state apparatus have remained, so that's good, but many are gone. And so it's impossible to predict accurately whether and how quickly the consolidation of political power will happen, not only in northeastern Syria, but in Damascus as well.
And also I'd like to move to another completely, it may look like a different subject, but still quite interconnected. It's Israeli-Turkish interaction in Syria. We understand that there have been some efforts to normalize relations between those two countries, and after 8th of December, the tensions in Syria between Turkey and Israel are quite evident. Do you believe that actually now we have reached the point of what one may call deconfliction, and any form of further escalation between Ankara and Tel Aviv will be obviated from now on?
I don't think that, again, that's predictable with any degree of reliability. I do agree very much that the level of tension has decreased significantly from a month or a month and a half ago or so, when there were ominous statements being issued on both sides about, you know, don't push me. And subsequently, yeah, there have been deconfliction talks. The Israeli side, however, continues its bombing in Syria. There was a bombing attack by Israeli warplanes or missiles near the presidential palace in Damascus recently. And whenever that happens, of course, I think Turkey gets uncomfortable because it sees itself in many ways as, I shouldn't say the protector of a new Syria, but as the enabler of a new, more promising Syria to emerge, and doesn't want to see it destable. You know, back just before October 7th, back in 2023, Turkey and Israel were about to normalize relations. You recall that President Erdogan, Prime Minister Netanyahu met in New York at the United Nations. I was in touch with officials of the Turkish government at the very highest level who were saying it's fantastic, relations are about to normalize, and energy cooperation is going to be at the center. And then after the horrific Hamas attacks on October 7th, all of that fell apart.
Ambassador, thank you very much for your time. Indeed, we discussed a number of issues, and I think they're all there, of course, naturally interconnected. But I remember when, in late February, when Abdullah Öcalan, the jailed leader of the PKK, made an announcement calling on the members of its militant group to disarm. The question was that, is it finally final? And then again, this Congress made an announcement on self-dissolution. Some people are saying, is there anything in the wording of the announcement that may give rise to a possibility of self-renewal, or there's always question, is it file or not? Of course, naturally, there's no clear answer to all of those questions, but it looks like, and I'm sure you agree with that something fundamental has changed about this subject as of May 2025. Thank you very much for your time, Ambassador. So grateful.
Thank you, Erkan. Great to be with you. Really nice. Great, thoughtful questions.
Thank you very much indeed. That's all from us for now. The declared dissolution of the PKK may mark a turning point, with many regarding it a watershed moment, not just in the history of Türkiye, but that of the wider region. As ever, the region watches and waits. Thank you for watching Context. Until next time, goodbye.